My name is Jim Koba. I'd like to introduce my colleague. This is Chris Hutchins. He's the Associate Vice President of Healthcare Analytics at Northwell Health. Chris is a senior healthcare leader with about 20 years of experience developing analytic teams and established data governance, warehousing, business intelligence implementation, and delivering solutions. He's been focused on patient experience outcomes, cost control, population health, quality, regulatory, pretty much the gamut of things of interest for healthcare organizations today, and has extensive experience with organizational transformation and in gearing up new types of programs and integrating analytics. Chris will walk you through some of the parts of the presentation here. I'll handle the drier, less interesting parts. And my name is Jim Koba. I'm a director with PERFICIENT's National Healthcare Practice. I've been doing this on the top side of 30 years now, here and there. Mostly my experience is in the provider organization. I've worked extensively with healthcare organizations in BI and analytics. Like I said, we have a story here to tell you, and hopefully you find it as interesting as we found it as interesting to do. So let's start off with the legal stuff. We have no conflicts of interest that we can report. That doesn't mean I'm not conflicted, but with no conflicts of interest. What are we going to do today? I'm going to give you kind of the overview of the objectives. I'm going to turn it over to Chris here, who will kind of explain the situation at Northwell, what we needed to be able to accomplish, and then how we align and delivered that. Then I'll come back in and tell you a little bit more about how it really unfolded, which is not quite the same as the theory. So theory and practice are a little bit too different, but I think that's where some of the interesting stuff is. Come back in to summarize, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Please gear up. We really do welcome some interaction at the end of the event, hopefully to give you some value out of this. So why are we here today? I think you may have read the flyer. Hopefully this is going to be of interest to you. We're here to look at the key techniques in building partnerships with the business, as well as partnerships with the delivery organization and other people that help you gear up as an organization to be able to stand up a new program and deliver value to your organization. We're going to be able to walk through comparing some best practices, what really worked, talk about that. We're going to do this in story format, so it's not like we're standing up lecturing on the things to do. We want to tell you a story of how it unfolded. And then we want to talk about the importance of the clinical data warehouse as the underpinning foundation of this exercise and how that really led to self-service analytics driving value. Like I said, we're going to do this more in story format, so we want to walk through discovery of how Northwell's journey actually executed, and hopefully you can learn some of the techniques that we used. We can talk a little bit more about things that you might be thinking of and may or may not have worked, at least in this situation. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, folks. I'm happy to tell you a little bit about our experience at Northwell Health. And this is the traditional background information on our health system. I think the bigger story here, more than the numbers, is the complexity in the environment, which we'll hear a little bit about today. But we're primarily located on Long Island in downtown Manhattan, in that area. We have over 23 hospitals, or $11 billion-ish organization. The number changes on a regular basis. There's a pretty aggressive growth strategy that the health system is undertaking, in particular in the ambulatory space at this point in time. As you can see, there's some pretty staggering numbers. What this doesn't tell you is that we have, and some of my colleagues are in the audience, they'll tell you, we have enterprise solutions, but not in the way that you might think of them. We have multiple iterations of enterprise solutions, many times in the same space, which is why our organization really needed some help from some experts, as Jim and his colleagues from Proficient have been able to provide for us. Again, this is just a little bit about the service area, so you can see we're kind of spread out across the island in Metro New York. The mission's really simple. If some of you stopped by our booth in the exhibition hall, you may have met our fearless leader, Michael Dowling, who's the president and CEO. The goal is really simple, and it's been the same. Be better tomorrow than we are today. We're a healthcare organization. The patient really is the primary, secondary, and third, fourth, fifth, 1 through 10 priorities. That's it for us. And we're really geared towards improving community health, providing high quality care, educating our health professionals, educating our patients, and truly driving innovation and redefining the way we deliver care to make sure that we have a culture of process improvement regardless of what end of the spectrum. And the patient experience is really an important aspect of what we're focused on. To support the mission, we're trying to identify innovative ways to improve the way we deliver care. And my charge in particular is really in the analytics space. How do we leverage our data to enable the kind of change that our physicians are charged with delivering, and making sure that we have the right information available to them at the point of care to make better decisions. And from a tactical perspective, as many of you may or may not be in the midst of here, if you're in the midst of trying to figure out how do you make the case in your organization to do the things you need to do to establish analytics, one of the blessings for us was that we had the state district program that came along that really kind of put us in a position where we had to get some things moving rather quickly to be able to provide the level of quality analytics to meet the needs of the district program and really to qualify for the funding that's required for us to advance the way that we're delivering care to meet the requirements of the program. If you're not familiar with it, it's really geared to do redesign and improvement in the way that you deliver care. And what's a little bit different, we're not just accountable for our measurements as an organization, but we're accountable collectively with our colleagues across the New York area to improve the processes for care delivery, irregardless of what organization you're part of. So being able to share information is a really critical component, which kind of means that you've got to have your house in order so that you can submit data in a really consistent format where it can be aggregated to meet the needs of the organization to do the reporting at the state level. We're talking about significant dollars. As you can see, it's $6.4 billion that are available for funding. And so we really wanted to make sure that we work together with our partners to put together a really good business case to be able to qualify to get some funding to help us to get the infrastructure in place to do the level of analytics that we need. The end of the day for us, it just meant we had a whole lot of work to do. I won't understate the time and energy it took to get everything in place, both internally and with the state government, to get approvals to do all of this. But that was the tip of the iceberg, and that was months and months of effort to get to that point. But the real work we had to do was to stand up the infrastructure to really create a single integrated view of our own clinical claims, financial data, and EMR data, and then put together a platform that allowed the folks that are doing the analytics in multiple verticals across the health system to do what they needed to do and advance at a pace that meets the business needs, while we're still actually charged with building some enterprise platforms and creating that enterprise perspective to do analytics for quality performance, as well as a number of other areas for financial performance in the health system. The payoff for us, it's actually massive. We have a number of verticals in the health system. We have, you'll see some examples here, but we have folks doing analytics on quality. We have folks doing analytics for claims. We have folks doing analytics in the revenue cycle, pop health management. I suspect most of you have a lot of these programs, and probably some I don't have to be dealing with at the moment. But the intent was to get some things in place that allow them to do what they do while we're focused on the foundation building that really enables us to meet the needs for the district program and quality reporting. Then probably as important as all of this is the work that we had to do resulted in getting us the level of engagement from both the clinical, financial, and executive and operational stakeholders to start to prioritize and drive the analytic agenda for the organization. That's really kind of a big deal, and as you see the story unfold today, I think you'll understand why that's such an important thing. And most of us, when we walk into an organization, have a general sense of what we have to do, but the harder part is how do we get the level of engagement to do it, because it's not easy. There's a lot of other components to it, whether it's multiple stakeholders needing to drive their agenda at their own pace, multiple funding models, there's organizational structural issues, where does analytics live, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure that's not new to you folks, but what we're going to talk to you about today really kind of highlights how we navigated through that. Getting into the rest of the story, I think this bottom row of scenarios, I'd be shocked if you all don't have a version of this in your own organization, but multiple initiatives, You're in a diverse, multifaceted organization, competing priorities, and a bunch of legacy solutions. If there's anyone who doesn't have that and you're looking to hire, please see me afterwards. But since you're at a healthcare conference, I suspect that's not the case. I'll hand it off to Jim to talk you through the realities versus the theory.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's a nice theory to be able to talk about getting together around a mission, and it's really good to work with an organization that does have a strong mission statement. And we'd like to believe we can go right from mission to strategy to developing a tactic. It's a nice, smooth flow all throughout. But the reality of most organizations, like at Northwell, is there's a lot already going on. There are things in flight. Those competing priorities are something we really needed to partner with the organization's leadership to help sort out as what is the most important thing to tackle. There's a lot of different ways to go about trying to support the mission or to even support the initiative for overall healthcare improvement. So it wasn't a disorderly journey, but it was certainly fraught with some interesting twists and turns along the way. And I'm going to try to walk you through this a little bit and get a feel for how we actually progressed through this. So first of all, getting started, there was really a three-part strategy, and that meant working with the business leaders to really understand the organizational priorities. We needed to be able to understand what was going with the IT infrastructure and technology, that current state, how ready was it to support the kind of initiatives we wanted to do. But we also needed to look at the organizational aspects, the DevOps component, how we were going to support the organization from a governance standpoint, whether it's governance of the information and data or governance of the actual IT solutions or the analytics developed, and look at all of these things together in order to be able to create a comprehensive program that we could not only execute in the first sense, but then keep this ball rolling for Northwell so they could continue to expand the platform and expand their ability to work with the business. So we started this out working very tightly with Chris, who was fairly new to the organization when this journey started. That worked really well for all of us. We engaged with the business through a strategy and discovery exercise initially. So we were working with many aspects of the business, probably almost 24 different communities or groups of stakeholders within the organization to understand their vision, what it is that they were trying to do, where some of these organizations were tightly coupled or closely aligned with each other. There were also pieces of the organization that were doing their own thing or had not started a journey but had needs. So it was understanding and identifying those things, in parallel, assessing the technical capabilities. That's where actually my part of the team came in. As you know from the intro, I'm a propeller head. So we had some very knowledgeable business folks interacting. We also had the technical interaction going on, working with the IT organization, and at the same time assessing the operating model. What's working today, what's not working today, what is really geared up to being able to drive the organization forward and be able to maintain the platform as well as maintain the interaction with the business. So one of the key exercises with all of those priorities is how do we engage as IT? How do we engage with the business in a partnership to understand and balance the priorities? There are multiple things. So out of those nearly 24 groups, I think we had a laundry list of around 100 different initiatives, small and large, that needed to be sorted through and balanced. So working together, we developed a scoring mechanism, which we had to iterate on multiple times and work through a scoring, feed that back to the business stakeholders that we were working with, get some feedback on it, adjust that scoring, and eventually that gave us some order to what we were looking at. What are the most high priority items that needed to be addressed for the business? What was the best way to get there? What are the initiatives we need to do in IT in parallel with what we're trying to accomplish the business to make those happen? And how do we bring the organization along quickly to be able to ramp up for this? So that was a key process in engaging the business and to try to make it a more objective mechanism to work through. That partnership with the business, I think, worked very well. It's one of the things I would highly recommend that we we do and engage over and over again, and it's a constant shift. So as, I don't know if any of you, but I've never worked with an organization whose priorities stayed stagnant for longer than a few months. You know, things shift pretty quick. We have new regulations, new initiatives government-wide, new priorities to deal with in healthcare all the time. And it's important to keep this engagement model active and keep an open dialogue with your business community, with your stakeholders and your drivers to be able to get where you want to go and adjust your roadmap and your development overall. So one of the key outcomes to be able to communicate what we learned, after we established the high priorities, we started looking at what we needed to accomplish. We came up with a roadmap. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the roadmap. It's more than a bit of an eye chart, especially for somebody like me. But I think key in here is we had a business roadmap. What are the objectives we want to accomplish? What's the relative timing of those objectives? How can they build on each other? And that, like I said, took some interaction. And it's not a straight translation of priorities. We do number one first, because there's a natural progression of some of these work efforts to build on another. So working with the organization, we were able to establish that business roadmap. That in turn, understanding the current state of the IT and technology platform, let us put together a roadmap of what are the technology components we either needed to build or enhance or bring together. And in this case, a lot of what needed to happen, as Chris alluded to earlier, there wasn't a lack of information. There was a lot of clinical information, business operation information available. It wasn't coalesced. It wasn't integrated and brought together into a single usable view, a trusted source of truth. And that was the first priority, is we needed to establish that trusted source as a foundation and work on that, which took a bit of a lead time, but that's what we focused on first. And in parallel, starting to engage the business on the types of analytics the business wanted to be able to conduct based on that information. And that was an evolving situation, because you have to help the business understand what data you can bring in, what data is going to be actionable or available to them in the early stages, what do they need to wait on. But again, having that business roadmap gave us a vehicle and a communication mechanism to work with the business to help make that communication and that education process work a little better. And then lastly, the bottom part really deals with the governance part of the organization. What do we need to establish data governance over our master data elements specifically, as well as what do we need to do operationally with the analytics team? How do we organize the analytics team? Is the analytics team purely an IT thing? In this situation, no. We needed to co-join pieces of IT as well as the IT liaisons with the business and get some co-location and get synergy developing by having that team work more as a cohesive whole. So, as I already alluded to, something near and dear to my heart is the enterprise data warehouse. That was the key part of the foundation that we built with Northwell. This allowed us to get a single view of patients on one platform. We focused initially on clinical information, but then started to expand out to patient experience. There's further expansion moving into revenue cycle data, as well as operational parameters, and it's an ongoing, evolving situation and data platform growing all the time. We also really had to deal a lot with throughput latency. You know, how old is the data that you can action on? So one of the things and a challenge in a warehouse environment, these are not your operational systems, and by definition, you need to have something separate to bring in this many different operational systems to pull this data together, so you need an extra thing, but that introduces delay to the information. So one of the key things we had to do is not only build the mechanisms to aggregate and pull and integrate this information, we had to really work on streamlining the processes, making sure the data flow was happening in a near real-time or as close to a real-time situation as we can get. And we had to hit operational windows so data availability was out there, which is, again, part and parcel with understanding what the business needs and when they need it, and gearing and tuning your IT system to be able to support those activities and to support that data currency that you need to have. One of the things Chris is going to show, we have a couple of examples of some of the dashboards. It's the pretty shiny stuff, so nobody likes looking at the plumbing. Everybody likes looking at the pretty shiny stuff. So Chris has got some of the nice shiny things and a few things to walk through here at the end. I think it's always important to be able to look at, we did all of this stuff, but yeah, what did I really get out of it? So Chris has got some examples he's going to walk you through here at the end. So back to engaging with those nearly 24 business units. In the early phases of the rollout of this information, these are a sample of the main units that we're starting to get actionable information and make use of the analytics to start doing improvement in their processes and improvement in the care process that critical parts of this organization support. So Chris will talk a little bit more about the examples. You see some little snippets here. But I think that's, again, important. What I want to emphasize is the need that not only do you engage with that business once, but you continually engage with that business over and over to be able to adjust, understand where their pressures are. You give them a little bit of information. As the business starts to work with that, they realize what more they need or what is maybe less useful, and you start to adjust and shift your focus over time. One of the other things that we had is the reliance that Northwell had on this information, the need to be able to keep this actionable, to be able to work on it, required a very high available environment. That's not typical in a lot of warehousing situations. They're kind of viewed as something more after the fact. But in this, because it played a critical role in what Northwell was trying to do for its own internal improvement techniques, the availability of these dashboards was critical. And given the size of the organization, the number of different systems, there's a lot of moving components. So ramping up an operational support area to be able to manage the reports, being able to handle the high availability of views, being able to deal with issues and problems in a timely manner to turn those around, that's all critical to be able to keep your users invested and keep them basically satisfied so that they keep coming back to your system and trust it not only for the information, but trust that it's going to be there when they need it. Nobody likes to turn on the water tap and not get a drip, right? So part of the analytics organization that came together was really built around the clinical data strategy. And again, clinical data was the starting point, so that's what we're emphasizing here. But if you look at the analytics organization, this isn't a purely technical organization. It has technical components, but I really want to talk about that data integrity and governance component, the analytics resource center. These are the things that give you the most high visibility touch points with the business, to be able to interact with that business and work with them on a regular basis that supports. You know, I got to keep the database running. I got to be able to manage my data, transform it, and move it through the pipe as quickly as possible. I have to build the dashboards. I have to be able to maintain and modify them, but I need to stay in touch with the organization. And one of the things that Northwell discovered and was led by Chris's transformation was bringing in a cross-section of support within the one analytics organization. So bringing in the people who directly are working and reporting against, in this case, the district program, we're sitting right next to the IT developers, the ETL developers, the analytic report developers, all in a common room. We could interact on any moment when we needed to have a hallway conversation. This really helps, one, a unifying team structure, so you are all pulling towards the same direction, but it also just speeds the communication process. So delivery and follow through, like I alluded to earlier, it's not a one and done situation. So we had pre-release engagement. So in addition to getting those priorities up front, we needed to get the business back engaged as we started to stand up data and make things available in the environment. And one of the things to do that, you can communicate about what you're going to see, but it's nice to be able to give them something to touch and feel. So we engaged them early in actually data validation and QA processes, engage key stakeholders, to get those people to start interacting with the data, encouraging them to explore, which then help communicate out to the rest of the organization around those key stakeholders what was coming, what was available, how could they start to develop some of their own analytics or some of their own uses, and how could they engage better because they could actually see and feel and touch, and they're trying to do that as early in the process as possible. Education, training of those consumers. So how do you use the analytics tools? What is that data available? That's an ongoing situation to make sure people are up to speed on what's available so that they can actually make good use out of it. how does this report work? What's underneath the covers? What is it really showing me? How do the calculations work? That's metadata that needs to be made available to folks, but it also needs a personal touch to be able to help educate folks on really what that means. And then, of course, being ready to handle questions. So it kind of like our QA at the end of this, we want to be able to get some interaction going with people so that they can engage and get their questions answered, which means you have to have people ready to be able to answer those questions. And they need to be able to engage at a level that the business is comfortable with. They don't want a technobabble answer to what is fundamentally a business question. And then lastly, as I talked about the iterative nature, we needed to re-engage with the business as things started to roll out. What is working for you? What's really working well? What is not working? What's missing in the information? How do we need to readjust priorities or data acquisition based on this? Is there a different path we need to adjust? And that's an ongoing process that Northwell is now employing to be able to grow and expand this platform and its program over time. So as it moves off of Disrupt and starts to tackle other large initiatives, that key rollout is once you establish that connectivity, keep it going. Keep working with those folks. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, that I think there's some interesting things in here, and this is the pretty shiny part.
Thank you, Jim. I think one of the interesting areas to tackle, and I suspect that many of you in this room are in organizations that are either in the process of addressing this or you're trying to figure out how do you tackle it. And it's really from an organizational standpoint, how do you get things in place to be able to support the analytic vision or the objectives that the organization has. And there's many philosophies, where does analytics live and all of that. The approach that I tried to take was not so much focused on where it lives, but standing up a function that's a resource to the organization so that no matter what direction those decisions take us, we have not only the framework and infrastructure that we talked about already this morning, but we've got a model where folks are coming to us as a resource to help them meet their business objectives. If you charged me to build a centralized organization that's capable of handling the depth of clinical analytics, financial analytics, you can pick whether it's quality, population health, supply chain. The reality is, and you all know this in healthcare, there are very deep verticals, multiples of them, even if you just want to focus on specialties. And for us to accomplish that, it would be impossible for me to amass a team to do that. If I try to take the folks that are best at it, I'm pulling them away from the points where they're actually continuing to advance. And pretty soon their knowledge just becomes stagnant. So how do I provide them with tools to advance? And how do I structure my own internal organization, small or big, depending on your scenario? I think you can do this. But the objective is, how do you frame it in a way that I'm not trying to take over the world and build a centralized analytics group? Because there's too much to do for a big team or a small team. It really doesn't matter. So I was very fortunate to be able to identify someone that had been in the organization for over 20 years, primarily on the business side, happened to be a little tech savvy, which was helpful. But he's heading up our Analytic Resource Center, and we're promoting it as a resource, not as an analytics organization. And that's really working well for us because folks are really pulling on us. They're asking open and honest questions, and we're giving them objective feedback. We're charged with providing some analytic platforms, and we will absolutely do that. But our answer for them, no matter what they're asking of us, is, yes, we'll help you. And our charge is to figure out on what level we can help. Maybe it's project management, maybe it's data analysis, business and analysts, maybe it's full-blown development. But that's our focus, is to try to make sure that we're helping them to advance, because none of them are waking up in the morning just inventing things. They've got a very significant charge to deliver results in the organization. So we're just figuring out how do we fit in and on what level can we help them do that. One such example is in our patient experience data. I think I mentioned earlier that's a significant focus. Our mission is on the patient. And so there's a team that's really charged with focusing in on the patient experience in every aspect you can possibly imagine. The easy part for us was just getting a feed from the Press Ganey environment. And our technical team has stood that up, and they're making it really available. There's a nice data mart now that all that activity gets supported throughout the organization. If your organization is like ours, you may have people that are accessing the Press Ganey portal directly and downloading it, and they're all analyzing it and doing it their own way. That's okay if you don't have any organizational infrastructure to help support them. But this has really helped us now because our clinical leadership team, partnered with the business and strategy group, are sitting down and they're deciding which top box scores we want to focus on moving the needle on. And we're pushing that information out. And we're allowing people to access it whatever way that they need to. You can do dives and slice and dice, but we're at least at the starting point giving you the ability to look at the things that the organization is saying are really important right now. This is perhaps where it gets even more exciting and interesting. As you look at the organization's different verticals, you can look at things through a particular lens, but when you can start to bring in multiple data sources to see the full picture, that's where you start to really get some good value. What you're looking at here, forgive me, it is combining scheduling information, claims data, and clinical information. Where this is helpful, particularly for the district program, is we know that there are very specific orders that have to be made, there's tests that have to be administered that we're going to be measured by in order to qualify for funding or to avoid penalties, so cost avoidance. So this is a tool that we've stood up where a provider can look at their upcoming schedule, click on a date, they can see every patient that's scheduled and what outstanding items they have to fulfill the measures that we need to be paying attention to. And it allows them to be proactive in how they schedule. Folks have provider scorecards or some version of it or being pushed to create one. I'll bet you all do. One of the biggest challenges that we're faced with in our space, whether it's IT or analytics, is it's really difficult for physicians because they have so many different systems they have to access to do their job. And they're not looking for innovation that gets them more entrenched in your systems. They're looking for tools that enable them to spend more face time with the patient. And so what we're really looking at and listening to them, what do they need, bringing in the right types of data that help to answer the types of questions that they really need to be able to answer and get back to taking care of patients, which is why they went into practice to begin with. So what you're looking at here brings in their cart allocation, which really is how they're allocating their time into what functions within the health system. And that's relevant really when you're looking at doing benchmarking on productivity. If a guy's doing 30% of his time versus 80% of his time, you want to make sure you're not benchmarking him inappropriately against a group that's got a very different looking allocation. But you're looking at quality measures. We have a model that integrates both abstraction from the clinical notes and calculated results directly from the EMR. That's in a shared platform, shared by two different groups in the organization. It's one database structure, but they're both working on the same source. And similar to the card allocation, there's a specific team in the finance group that maintains that. We're not surfacing a copy. We've hooked in their data set, so it's only one copy of the data. And similarly, when you're looking at the patient experience, again, that's hooked into the data mart I mentioned previously that was shown on the previous slide. Then the access information, looking at the scheduling data coming out of our revenue cycle platform. Again, it's the same data set that everyone's using. And similarly on productivity, that's pulling data from our revenue cycle platform. And that's the same data set they're accustomed to looking at in a different view that's only focused on productivity. But it integrates it into a common view like this. We're currently in the process of standing up our physician revenue cycle information, which really gets into the more detailed stuff around how they're performing inside of the revenue cycle, lag times, service mix analysis, AR management, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the objective is to make it easy for them to get it in one place so they're not having to log into multiple systems, and hopefully not dealing with the pain that we all deal with, having to remember which password I'm supposed to be using and when's the last time I changed it, and did I write it down, or is it in my memory, is it in my phone? I don't know about you, but I'm horrible at that, and I probably am breaking a lot of best practices because I try to keep it simple. But we're trying to make that easier for them as well. And so this gets us down to really why we've had the success that we've had. And I don't want to understate this one, the importance of partnership, whether it's in the business or with trusted folks in the industry, like Jim and the team from Proficient. It's really, really important because You might know what to do, but there's a lot of folks that need to be involved, whether they're going to support you, advocate for you, get approvals for funding, or actually put their hands in the work and help you get it done. It's really important. And believe it or not, one of the criteria was not that they had to have a facial hair pattern looking like mine. But it didn't help. It didn't hurt the situation. Jim and I have gotten along great, as well as the rest of the team. But it really helps to drive buy-in and adoption across the organization if people are engaged. And what level of information do you have to provide them so that they know enough without overburdening them? That's a really hard balance to strike. But it's an important thing to work on, and I spend far more of my time than you might imagine figuring on what level of information to provide to which level of executive or which business stakeholder. But it's a really, really important one. I'm not a journalist, but I probably would do well to take some training. But then again, part of what we talked about with the Analytic Resource Center is we're educating our stakeholders. We're providing vehicles for educating them on what's now possible. A lot of them are not asking questions today that they could be asking because they've never had the opportunity before. The answer was we don't have the data. Or if we have it, it's not integrated. But we really have to spend a tremendous amount of time focusing on that to make sure that they know what's available. And then part of that in terms of establishing trust, we're establishing trust in the data, but also we're establishing trust in that we're their partner. And this comes into play when you're educating leaders that their folks are now trained on new technologies and new capabilities from an analytics perspective, and sometimes even new approaches to analytics. We're trying to make sure they know so that they have the ability to gauge whether their teams are advancing. Because we're trying to shift them out of data aggregation to do real meaningful analytics. And if we do this well, we're helping them to manage that, and they're challenging themselves and challenging their teams, and hopefully having to go after less and less resources, but actually building core competencies to a level where the quality and efficiency in the meaningful, actionable data analytics that they're getting are changing and transforming their organization. And then I think probably the third thing I really want to focus on just for a second is the way that we approached the partnership. And it really involved making sure that we're bringing experts at all levels in the space that we have. We knew Northwell way, and some of our folks worked in other organizations and even other industries. But our partners knew a cross-section of the whole healthcare industry. And it really gave us a diverse view of what is going on across the industry, which was really valuable to us because we didn't want to make decisions based on limited information. These guys had a really tremendous depth of best practice information that they could share with us that really helped us to be thoughtful around developing our model. Then in terms of the execution, we had their best experts side by side with my team through the whole process. And there was a transition that occurred early on. They're building and we're learning at their side. Then before long, we're building, they're coaching. And then ultimately where we are now, we're really doing the heavy lifting on all fronts, but we call them and consult with them on a regular basis to make sure that we're advancing our own capabilities, we're staying up and current on what's happening across the industry, and sometimes, frankly, we stumble across things we don't know what to do. And these guys are fantastic in helping us do that. So, excuse me. So to recap, really some of the more critical elements here, engaging with the business leaders during a strategic planning exercise. It's really important that they understand what you're trying to accomplish, but more important that they know that you're listening and you're trying to make sure that you understand and account for what are the most high priorities for the organization. And then number two is really educating the cross-functional leaders on the value and approach. Making sure that you have the executive buy-in that you need so that you're not having to constantly circle back and go ask for more money or go and have to explain again why it's important that you're doing what you're already in the middle of doing. And these are really, I would say, common sense, but I think it's really important for us to focus on these things. Maintaining that relationship between the business and IT, your analytics leadership, in some cases the business partners that you're using, those are important things. Don't fall asleep on them because it's an easy place where things start to fall down. And then all of a sudden you're getting questioned, why are we doing that again? And then right out of the gate, the heavy lifting is not the sexy analytics. Why we spent so much time talking through what it took to deliver is those dashboards that we showed you. That's not the hard stuff. The hard stuff is really getting the data in the right places, having the infrastructure in place, getting the organizational support to understand and to agree on what your priorities are, and really getting the data right so that people aren't making bad decisions because they've got bad information being provided to them. So I think we've covered these things, but these are really the main points for partnering. You just have to align on your business objectives, what your strategies are, what are the tactical milestones that you have, align those things, agree on your prioritization, and make sure that you establish a communication cadence and don't compromise. You've got to communicate. I don't know how many times we course adjusted in the course of our engagement, but it was multiple times, and we continue to do that in day-to-day operations. And then probably the most important thing, if you're starting out with your analytics program or you're in the midst of it, don't lose focus on delivering incremental value, because value is really the biggest thing you got to focus on. Because folks are looking for ROI, and analytics is a place that it takes a lot of investment from a time perspective to really truly get there. So really try to identify some good targeted milestones that you can deliver on quickly. When I say quickly, I don't mean necessarily like a week, but easily defined, structured projects that have a defined beginning and a defined ending point where you've got what they call minimum viable results or value. And so if you were paying attention early on, some fun questions here just to give you a chance to test your recall.
Actually to find out when you fell asleep.
Exactly. So just a show of hands, where do you think Northwell ranks in terms of their size, in terms of the largest health systems in America? If you think it's A, can I see your hand? Okay. B, 14th. Interesting. C, 24th. Okay. And D, 30th.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad to say it wasn't D. I didn't see any hands. That's good. We'll show you the answer momentarily.
Okay.
Jim, you want to take the next one?
Sure. So after the recap, what do you believe is the most important success criteria for analytics? Is it A, business value? Okay. B, fast infrastructure. C, multicolored visualizations. Thank you very much. And D, state-of-the-art technology. I like this group. All right, Chris?
Northwell Health used an enterprise data warehouse to feed its self-service analytics and drive business value. Who thinks that's true? Anyone think it's false? Awesome.
Congratulations.
And here you are. Congratulations.
You weren't sleeping.
And thank you for staying awake and paying attention. I appreciate that.
Yep.
With that, we're happy to take any questions that you might have. I believe the microphones are live in these two center areas. I'm hoping for some sunshine before I leave Florida. Now, we have a number of different priorities. Really, the biggest focus we have over the next 12 to 18 months really is twofold. One is to really beef up our analytic resource center and really drive adoption. We've launched a web portal that's getting a lot of attention right now, and frankly, it's causing our pipeline to get relatively full. But it's actually helpful because it's helping us to get the organization to see what the demand is, and it's giving us that vehicle to give them validated support. And what I mean by that is it's not just one or two people asking for certain types of analytics. We're seeing a really big spike in operational areas, emergency service line, for example. They're trying to do an awful lot, and they need a lot of help. And that gets a lot of attention, particularly from a chief operating officer, because he wants to know what's going on in real time. So that's one of the things. And I think the other piece, I don't know where you all are in your journey to cloud, but that's an area of focus. We've got to actually make a shift in the next 2 to 3 years to move our environment from on-prem into the cloud and still maintain not only the existing priorities from analytics, but start bringing in additional revenue cycle sources, supply chain, cost accounting, things of that nature. And again, not to try to decentralize everything and be better than they are, but to enable them inside of our environment and to enable the integration of the analytics.
Hang on a second. Yep.
What methods are you guys using to educate and train your consumers or end users, on these visualizations and analytics? Mm-hmm. And who's responsible for that? Is it IT? Are there super users across the organization?
Yeah, so the question was with regard to how we're educating and training, what vehicles we're using to provide that. And so there's really a two-pronged approach, and as I mentioned with the Analytic Resource Center, the charge of that function is to figure out what level of support we need to provide. And some business units actually may have folks that are really good at instructional design or development or business analytics. Maybe some groups can do their own BRDs, for example. But figuring out what level we need to engage. But we're absolutely going to provide the framework from an infrastructure standpoint where they can, on the portal, there'll be some what I call Captivate modules. I don't like to use technology in my answer, but that is a particular technology that we use to capture very short video vignettes or audio recordings that are targeted to answer specific questions. In the clinical space, we're not going to get a 4-hour audience with a physician very frequently. So we're trying to think about that in a way that we're able to answer the targeted types of analytics questions that they have. With regard to the visualizations and the development of that, there's a couple of ways that we've tackled it. There's a ton of stuff that's free online on YouTube. We try to have people do that. But we're also developing our own internal curriculum based on a combination of that, and also in partnership with some vendors that are really fantastic at storytelling to provide that kind of training for folks as well. It's very different than just writing a report. And honestly, one of the struggles we have is getting our report writers to think differently and deal with visualization. Does that help?
Sort of related along those lines, are you finding your business customers are taking action on the analytics, or are you finding that, and I don't know, maybe your resource center helps them see how to take action on the analytics you're providing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is yes, but I won't say that it's all because of the work that my team is doing in terms of how we're training them on analytics, but we're enabling folks that are in verticals. We have a group, for example, that deals with care coordination. We've provided some framework and technology for them, and they're developing the analytics there, and they trust themselves probably easier than they trust us, which is great. But they are making good decisions in terms of how we coordinate care and how we integrate the data from the claims data set into the EMR data set in particular. Those are areas where we're helping them to identify gaps in care, and it's actually relatively straightforward. If they think from the analytics they've developed that there's an opportunity and they go look in the EMR and that it bears that out, then that's a win. But the real big win comes when they do the follow-up on that coordination of care and it results in a visit, or we actually perform well against a particular metric that they're charged with meeting. Yes, sir.
Apologize if you already addressed this, if I missed it earlier. But could you speak again to your prioritization and the governing body or structure steering committee that you use? How do you deal with the one executive who thinks that their request is more important than the other executives?
That never happens.
I don't know what you're talking about. No, so there's a couple of different things that we did, and I can let Jim speak to the specifics in terms of how we did it initially. Then I'll talk about where we are now, post that, the road mapping exercise.
Yeah, so that scorecarding exercise that we did, it basically took in those initiatives, and we, with some knowledgeable folks in the unit, basically seeded that exercise by pre-scoring all of the different initiatives we had. But the way that process worked is to go back to the stakeholders, preferably in groups, and then read back what you're seeing on the scorecards, and using that process to get some feedback. People would react to the scorecard saying, I don't see why this is lower than that. Please explain this. So that led us to adjust the scoring, but that also brought folks together to understand that now that we have a scoring mechanism folks are seeing, they can see where their stuff lies compared to somebody else. But again, that by itself isn't enough. At the end of the day, you still need support from the CMIO, the CMO, the chief nursing officer. You have to have those people bought into the process to help reinforce the message. And we don't want to have a big hammer come down on anybody, but using the scorecard plus an engagement with the chief executives to help reinforce messaging was key in my opinion.
Yeah, I think subsequently in terms of how that translates into normal operating mode, the Analytic Resource Center is one vehicle that's helping us with that. So the whole idea of providing a self-service environment, I don't know how you all have worked through that process, but organizations tend to try to figure out, does this live in IT? Do we control it? Or do we really enable self-service? There's all the governance and compliance stuff that goes on. But the reality is, whether we liked it or not, we found out that people were going to download the free trial version of software and get people hooked on it and start buying licenses. So we figured we need to figure out, how do we provide an environment that they can work safely in? And for us, as a free service that we provided, we dealt with all the security requirements. So our CSIO is happy, and they're happy because they don't have to go through all the really difficult stuff to document and get approvals. But that gives us visibility into the analytics that folks are doing inside of that environment, which is really helping us to inform the roadmap. And so my director for the Resource Center brings to me consistently what types of things he's seeing in there. We're also gathering information from our report developers in terms of what types of activity folks are asking for analytics on. And we're bringing that to a subgroup of our executive team to tell them what we're hearing and have them weigh in on where do we spend our energy. Which things are most important are going to get us ROI sooner. And that doesn't mean the organization doesn't do anything in that space, but it prioritizes how we approach things from an enterprise perspective. And then my resource center still tries to figure out, how do we allow the business units to continue some of those things they're going to have to do without our help, frankly.
Thanks for your great presentation.
Thank you.
So with the examples that you had of the self-service analytics appeared to be standardized measures with common methodologies. Fantastic. Everybody needs a single source of truth, not just of the data, but of the measures.
Right.
How do you support executives that want a measure that's not on the dashboard? Or how do you support users, or how do you support users who express a need to access the atomic transaction level data, either out of the resource center or through some other means?
So a couple of answers on that. So in terms of accessing the atomic level, we're still early on in that, and the answer has been no up to this point. Folks have access to source level data already that's not in that environment, or some of it is. But depending on where we are in terms of developing enterprise level assets, and what I mean by that is data marts in particular, very targeted for readmissions, for example. We've got a very robust data mart that allows you to inquire against that data set from a variety of different perspectives, and we try to define it as broadly as possible, where we can confidently allow people to run free there and do their own dashboards, run their own queries against it. And we can be confident they're not going to get skewed information or that they can easily misinterpret. Similarly, we'll do that type of focus on our surgical. We're working on our emergency services one now, which is actually more real time. But getting to some standard definitions is actually an important part of it, and we're trying to drive that. But the executives have a way to go first and foremost to our portal to see what's been defined at an enterprise level. And then if it's not there, they work with us, and we help them to get things in place to get through that process. But in the meantime, the answer is not no, they can't have access to it. We're just making sure that as they're moving into the enterprise environment, we're not creating backdoors into information that they don't have access to already. But that access provisioning process has to stay a really important part of the process to make sure that folks are getting the appropriate level of training, and their executive oversight is aware of the types of analytics that they need to be doing.
Well, you actually alluded to this a little bit in your last answer, but in terms of data governance, how did you approach, or could you share a little bit about the strategies you used to get all the stakeholders to the table? and to engage them in
Right.
terms of defining the business terms, and when there was conflict, what you did about conflict resolution, so that, you know, you could come to some sort of harmonization or crosswalks, or, you know, how did you
Sure.
handle all of that?
That's a fun topic. But honestly, organizations go through probably fits and starts in this space. What we've chosen to do is really try to stay as tactical as possible. Let's make sure we're focusing on things that we absolutely have to solve right now. And so there's specific things that there's, diagnosis code is a great example, because there are a few different ways you can standardize that if you want to. And we have parts of our organization that standardize it in a way that is fine for them, but in my enterprise data warehouse, I'm not going to do. And so how we are measured from a performance standpoint by government agencies, that's our first approach to it. So if CMS has defined it for me, that's how I'm going to define it. And as a starting point, I'm going to ask my oversight to ratify the decisions or tell us what they really want if they want us to do a variation of it. But out of the gate, we are going to deliver in that environment and will enable what we're required to be reporting against from a regulatory standpoint. There's nuance to it. I don't know if anyone's defined an encounter successfully in your organization, but that's a tough one. But you have to figure out how to engage and on what level. But for us, it was really prioritizing the quality reporting we had to do for the district programs, the CMS star ratings, other things like that we're really using to get folks accustomed to hearing from us and having the conversation either to ratify or tell us, no, we need you to go back and look at it. But in our organization, there's, gosh, somewhere in the vicinity of about 500 people that I would say qualify at the executive level. And so getting them used to these types of really targeted conversations is really the key for us. And I'm sure we'll have some really tough ones ahead. But really focusing on what's tactical and what we're required to has been the safe place for us to start.
Thank you very much.
We have time for about one or maybe two more questions.
Yeah, real quick, you talked about high availability and real-time data.
Yep.
When it comes to value and what you're seeing in that throughout the day, I assume you're trickle feeding that data out into your warehouse. And I heard you say COOs, so you're hitting it the executive level when it comes to scorecards, dashboards. So is that your user base for the most part when you're trying to build this out real time, is more at that level? And do they need that data that fresh?
That's
So
a great question.
Let me hit on the real time there. If I said real time, I meant near to real time. So right now in the infrastructure, we are trying to move the needle as close to currency as we can, but we are still looking in a warehousing environment at about a day lag. Now, to get that day lag, what the point I was trying to make is that required a lot of optimization and throughput to be able to achieve that, given the number of different systems and the transaction volume we were dealing with. So just as an example of something you got to keep working at as you're building the infrastructure, is when we first started that out, that transaction process, when we first got it before it was in release mode, was taking about 12 hours per run, give or take. And through a lot of optimization, which we had to build into the plan to be able to optimize this, because this is the way it is. First get it to work, then make it fast. So we ended up getting that down. Our SLA window is about 4 hours for the process for raw acquisition. And we're now hitting that. So about a day. Back to your question, I'll let Chris kind of talk more about the business need.
Right.
But most of the functions that we were looking at in the initial roadmap did not require real-time access. When it did, we really looked in partnership trying to direct that user more towards the operational system, which isn't always possible if they need some sort of integration. But for the most part, the things that were high priority on the roadmap weren't forcing us into that area right away.
Yeah, so relative to real-time stuff, there's really two different areas where I suspect most organizations are really focused on, and that's really running your outpatient facilities or your inpatient shops, so you're admitting in discharge information or your scheduling information. But then from an operational standpoint, our focus has been pretty heavy for the last few months on our emergency services division. We're very fortunate. We've got some fantastic physician executives there. They're also really technical, and they're really helping us to refine the models. We are hitting against our production environments, replicated copies of them. Forgive me if there's any EMR owners in the room in terms of having to protect that environment. We're not hitting it directly, but we have real-time replicated copies that we hit. And we're seeing latency, probably, the worst case scenario would be about 5 minutes in that space, but we have over 23 hospitals in the health system, over 700 outpatient facilities, and I'm not sure what the latest count is on emergency rooms, but they really need to know and understand what's happening in those environments on a real-time, really close to real-time basis, so we focus on that. And if people are asking me for real-time stuff beyond that right now, I direct them back to the CMIO and encourage them to work with him to figure out what they can get embedded into the EMR itself, because it's really not a practical use for the data warehouse environment to do things that really are better suited for that operational tool. But we do try to focus on that imbalance. Because again, emergency services is a completely different breed, and I can't argue that real-time is valuable there.
Thank you. Well done.
You're welcome.
Do you still have a question? Have we got it covered? All right. All right, well, our time
If
is
we
up.
just have
Oh,
one
do
more
we have
just
one more?
Quickly, yeah. Okay.
Could you speak a little bit, I noticed you mentioned validation earlier. Now, do you have a formal validation methodology that you use that you impose upon your end users, or do you kind of hand off the analytics to them and leave the validation to them?
So there's really two ways that we approached it. One is, I don't know if you saw this slide, how we are organized. We have a physician-led team of folks that are really embedded to drive clinical content review as part of the plan for our implementation. We worked with those guys to really define what level of validation is going to be required for them to sign off that our underlying data structure is tight and things are defined appropriately, and we can sign off and say, yeah, we delivered it.
Also, some per use case is
Yeah,
variable.
Yes, right.
Their structure was use case based in that initial release because we were measure based. They really looked at snippets of the measure logic to be able to say, I need to be able to support this. In an isolated case, they could run a query against the raw information, run it in against this, and the criteria is my answers had to match if I ran against it raw. So the use cases had to be kind of selected so that you're not requiring integration to be able to validate that. But you really are looking at, I need my warehouse to represent what's in my operational systems exactly. If it's wrong there, it's going to be wrong here, but we want them to match. So we did do two levels. We also do technical data validation as part of just the internal IT QA process, but that's not the same as validating the results more from a clinical or business operational side.
Right, and we actually had a two-step approach to that, and we still use that today. So the clinical content team still does a full review. So they're part of the BRD process. Before a developer touches anything, it's being reviewed. And success criteria has to frankly be documented in the business requirement document so that we know that before we pass it to an end user, we're making sure we can satisfy the basics that they're telling us that they have to have. And so the developers are accountable to do their own smoke test, or however you want to refer to it, to make sure that, okay, if you go to execute, does it complete, and does it give you a result that you should be expecting based on what's in that document. And at that point, then we engage an end user, and we go through a basic process for them to be comfortable and sign off and say, yeah, you guys have met that standard, and we're comfortable to put it in production.
All right, thank you all. Chris and I will be here for another few minutes. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.